Hello, my name is Cindy Hansen, and I'm Orca Network's Education and Advocacy Coordinator. Orca Network's a nonprofit with several programs involved in public outreach and education, citizen science. For more information about any of these programs, please see our website and Facebook page. Today, I would like to talk to you about the southern resident orcas and the ongoing efforts to prevent their extinction. There are two ecotypes of orcas that can regularly be seen in the Salish Sea. They're considered the same species, but are very different from one another. Transients are also known as bigs, named after Michael Bigg, who was one of the first researchers to begin studying the orcas in the 1970s. They typically live in small pods or family groups of about 4 to 6 individuals, although they will get together in larger groups on occasion. And they eat marine mammals, so seals, sea lions, porpoises, even other whales. Residents, on the other hand, live in larger pods with extended family members. So mom, grandma, kids, grandkids, aunts, uncles, cousins. So imagine if you spent your entire life with all of your relatives. That's what the resident orcas do. These are fish-eating orcas, and their main diet is salmon. It makes up about 90% of their diet. Their society is matrilineal, meaning mom is basically in charge, and the family bonds are incredibly strong. Even adult sons and daughters stay with their mothers their entire lives. Here in the Salish Sea, we have what are called the southern residents, which consists of 3 pods or families called J, K, and L pods. Residents and transients have different diets, different behaviors, and they have been genetically distinct for tens of thousands of years. They don't mate with one another, don't socialize, and don't even speak to each other. Their calls are like different languages. So I want to play some of their calls, and hopefully you'll be able to hear the difference. The resident orcas, first of all, again, are 3 pods, J, K, and L. They make up the same community called the southern residents. And so since they're in the same community, they can communicate with each other and understand each other. But each pod has calls that are kind of like their own unique accent. So it would be like having somebody from Washington State, somebody from New York, and Texas having a conversation. Same language, but a little bit of a different accent. So this is what J-pod sounds like. K-pod we call the kittens. And L-pod, a lot of people think sound like birds. And then the bigs or transient orcas sound very different from them. This is an example of their calls. The Center for Whale Research has been studying the Salish Sea orcas since the 1970s. And what they and other researchers found early on is that every individual can be identified by the shape of their dorsal fin and the saddle patch behind their dorsal fin. Each orca is given an alphanumeric designation by the Center for Whale Research, such as J22, and a nickname by the Whale Museum, such as Oreo. And because every individual is known, we know exactly how many individuals are in this population. Now, before I talk about the status and threats, it's worth mentioning that the tribes around the Salish Sea have always revered orcas and have a special relationship with them. Some consider them their relatives under the sea. Unfortunately, that hasn't always been the case with the non-Indigenous population. Orcas were regularly shot at and considered pests, and in the 1960s and 70s, many of them were captured and taken away from their families for a life in captivity. It's estimated that up to 1/3 of the southern resident population was removed in just 12 years. Orcas in captivity have a much shorter lifespan than in the wild, so all of the southern residents who were captured have died except for one. Tokitai, also known as Lolita, is one of the oldest living orcas in captivity, and she's been living in the oldest, smallest orca tank in North America since 1970. Orca Network has been working to bring her back home to her native waters to a sea pen for many years now, and the Lummi Nation is also involved in these efforts. I've pretty put a few websites up here if any of you would like to learn more about these efforts. The historical population for southern residents was thought to be somewhere between 100 to 150 individuals. When the captures ended in 1976, there were only 70 left. They did begin to recover when the captures stopped and then declined again in the 1990s, when they lost almost 20% of their population in just 6 years. This led to them being listed as endangered in both the US and Canada, but they have not recovered. And in fact, they have declined even more since their listing. They're currently at only 75 individuals. One of the current threats is noise and disturbance. Orcas use echolocation to find their food, so if there's too much noise, it can possibly disrupt their foraging. There are steps being taken to quiet the waters. There's a speed limit around the orcas, which is important because studies have shown that speed is the biggest contributing factor to noise. There are also some voluntary measures being put in place for shipping traffic, and more education with recreational boaters will hopefully make a difference with those who don't know or understand the regulations or why they're even important. The orcas in the Pacific Northwest are some of the most toxic marine mammals in the world. They have high concentrations of contaminants like PCBs, DDT, flame retardants that build up in the food chain and magnify with each step. So the orcas, being at the top of the food chain, are getting a huge amount of these. The biggest threat for southern residents is lack of prey. Again, they are fish eaters, with salmon making up about 90% of their diet. Chinook salmon makes up the bulk of that, with coho and chum also being important at certain times of year. Most salmon runs are depleted throughout the range of the orcas. When they don't get enough to eat, the other issues become more of a problem, particularly contaminants, which are stored in the blubber and then are released during times of starvation. What's interesting to note is that Biggs orcas are around the same vessel traffic and have even higher contaminant levels than residents because they eat higher on the food chain. They're eating marine mammals that are eating fish. And yet the Biggs are thriving. The population is at around 500 individuals. They're fat and healthy, and the population is growing at a steady rate. The main difference between the two is food abundance. Biggs orcas have a plentiful supply of seals and sea lions and porpoises, while residents are struggling to find enough fish. What all of this has led to is a high rate of reproductive failure in the southern residents. This female, J32 or Rhapsody, died at 18 years old when she was pregnant with a full-term calf. She wasn't able to expel the fetus, and that ended up causing her death. And many of you probably saw this sad story on the news in 2018. This female, named J35 Tahlequah from J-Pod, gave birth to a calf that died a short time later, and then she spent the next 17 days carrying her baby's body throughout the Salish Sea, out to the ocean and back again. It was called a tour of grief, and it was seen around the world. And what researchers from the University of Washington's Conservation Canines team have discovered is that there's a 69% miscarriage rate in the southern resident orcas. However, there is good news and some hope. After a 3-year period with no surviving babies, 2 calves were born in 2019, and 2 more were born in September of 2020. And just a few weeks ago, scientists from the Center for Whale Research identified a 5th calf. And at this point, these babies all seem to be healthy. So this is great news and an indication that with enough salmon, they will be able to successfully reproduce. So what is being done to help these orcas recover? Well, there are recovery efforts happening everywhere from Northern California to British Columbia. Here in Washington, Governor Inslee created a task force in 2018 that met for 2 years. They created 49 recommendations that led to new legislation on salmon recovery, pollution prevention, noise reduction, and oil spill response. And some of this work is still ongoing. We have a lot of work to do, but there are definitely some hopeful signs. There's also a lot of conservation and education and advocacy work being done by nonprofit organizations and individuals. At Orca Network, we are grateful for all of our partners we work with. It's going to take all of us working together to create the kinds of changes needed for these whales to someday thrive. If you're interested in learning what you can do in your life to help, please visit our website to find this action card. In honor of Tahlequah's 17-day tour of grief, this card lists 17 actions people can take to help with recovery efforts. So I would like to close by asking a question. What will we lose if we lose the southern residents? We won't just be losing a distinct population of orcas, we'll be losing a unique and special culture. This is a quote from Alexandra Morton, an orca and salmon biologist who's kind of a hero to those of us doing this work. She said that if we lose the southern residents, it will be the first extinction where every individual's name was known. But we do have the ability to prevent their extinction if we care enough and take action. Thank you for listening.